see, here goes. All right, I think it's working.
I guess it's working, but I don't see any sign. Where should I see the sign?
Okay, no problem. I think it's all good then.
Sure.
Audio settings. Wait. Okay. I think it. All right. I think it should all be working right now. Okay. Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, no. Folks and comrades.
Recording.
Yes.
Now I see phase recording, so no problem.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. All right,
yeah.
friends. Okay, friends and comrades. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And we are joined in another edition, all things Israel, with Gideon Levy. Gideon Levy is part of the editorial board of Haaretz, of the Haaretz newspaper and Haaretz English. One of the big Israeli newspapers, more on the liberal left of the political spectrum in Israel. He's a columnist for Haaretz. He's an outspoken critic of his home country of Israel, and that's what we're going to be talking about today: the state of affair of Israel, and how the global people power movement, anti-colonial movement, can push back against the Ultra Zionist project. So first of all, Mr. Levy, it's an honor to have you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Youri.
Yes, it's a real honor to have you on, and let's just already jump right into the state of affairs in Israel. Now, the first question I want to ask you is what happened to the Labor Party of Israel, which was the dominant political force in Israel, rival party in Israel. Why are they almost of non-existent? And it's this ghastly blue and white party, which is the rival oligarchic Zionist party against Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party.
Yeah, Labor. You should judge Labor in a broader context, namely the Israeli left or the Israeli Zionistic left.
Yeah.
And people like me claim that there is a built-in contradiction between being Zionist and being leftist.
Yeah.
This is covered in Israel, nobody would admit it. But Labor throughout the years found itself leading to nowhere, in a deadlock, because they have nothing to offer. They support the occupation as much as the right-wingers do.
Yeah.
They support Jewish supremacy as much as the right-wingers do, because they are Zionists. So what's the difference? And then came also a personal vacuum in which Labor didn't create any kind of potential leadership. And they changed their chairmen one after the other because none of them could really deliver the goods. And here we stand with a total hollow Labor Party and hollow leftist Zionistic movement in Israel, where Israel turned into becoming really, by far, the most right-wing society that we have ever had.
And that being said, because I completely agree with you that Labor's left-wingism, if it ever had any left-wingism, it was only for only for Israelis, not for Arab Israelis, certainly not Arab Israelis who don't subscribe to Judaism. But is it safe and also the Black Panther Party of Israel started under Golda Meir, and I was very surprised when Leah Terechonsky told me that Likud, which everyone says is the ultra right wing of Israeli politics, actually appealed to the Black Panther Party, saying that, like, hey, we're a party for all sorts of Jews, Sephardi Jews, Russian Jews, Ashkenazi Jews. But now what we see with the Labour Party is that wasn't the death of them also that in terms of the economic program, they're also not that much different from Likud. So therefore people go, well, I can't keep supporting this party. And that's why you have the blue and white party and the coalition of the far left, you know, the Israeli Communist Party, who are friends with to the Arab Israeli parties who want to see a dismantling of the ultra Zionist state of your country.
You see, economy is not really discussed subject. I mean, when it comes to elections, it's always about occupation, or like in the last 3 elections, it's all around, are we in favor of Benjamin Netanyahu or are we against him? This is the division line of the society in Israel today, as hollow as it sounds. Bibi yes or Bibi no. And those who say yes, they are his blind followers. And those who say no, they think that he is the Satan, not less than this. And both of them exaggerate.
Wow, unbelievable. And that's a perfect segue then to my second question, which is because I asked you about this off the air, but let's get into it. So can you talk to us about the ongoing coronavirus crisis, how it's impacted Israel, and how do you and some of your colleagues critically assess the coalition government's response to coronavirus? What are your criticisms, and what are your criticisms of the entire coalition government's response to coronavirus, and what are your thoughts on the anti-corruption protests of Netanyahu, which have been the biggest protests going on in Israel since people were protesting against the housing crisis and even protesting against the Iraq war before the invasion took place, with Bibi Netanyahu and Ariel Sharon's full support?
So when it comes to coronavirus, there is not much room for political speculations. You judge the results. And the results, I must say, are extremely impressive. Israel went out of this crisis, at least for the time being, as if it never occurred. Life is totally normal back in Israel, like maybe no other country in the world. All this thanks to the vaccinations. And here, someone has to give the credit to the Prime Minister, to Netanyahu.
Okay.
Because unlike some other populist leaders like Bolsonaro and Donald Trump, who underestimate this crisis from its beginning and really didn't take it seriously, Netanyahu was very early in understanding the danger and reacting to it. And the fact that over 60% of the Israelis are vaccinated today is not something that someone can just say, oh, it's just good luck. No. Here, I think Netanyahu deserves a full credit. And the outcome is that we are beyond it. We are above it. We are after it.
Interesting.
It has nothing to do with the coalition government because it was really his project. And like we always attack him on everything that happens in Israel, one should give him also the credit when he did something properly and really I would even say with a vision. We have also quite a good health system, which he didn't succeed to destroy, and that helped a lot. But by the end of the day, we are getting out of the crisis as quite with a lot of, I mean, I could say we can be happy about the way the government dealt it, even though on the way there were many, many mistakes. But you know, who was prepared for this crisis?
Yeah.
Who thought, who could foresee it? Nobody.
So do you disagree then with the previous guests on this show, your fellow countryman Miko Peledz, also a critic of the state of Israel. Because when I asked him about how Israel's response to the coronavirus has been, he was very critical of Netanyahu, but in general he was critical of the entire state of Israel, because he says that because since the founding of Israel there's been this ongoing colonial project, and because of Israel's militarism towards Lebanon, Iran, supporting Kagame in Rwanda, supporting brutal right-wing dictatorships and other reactionary governments across the world, because of Israel's militarism, basically. He says that with that, plus the neoliberal economics Israel has adopted since the 1980s, or more than 1990s, that the healthcare system and the education system is in shambles, and there's been a growing gap between rich and poor. And because nobody connects it to the occupation of Palestine, in which too much money is spent on this colonial project, that's why coronavirus has hit Israel really hard. But you seem to have a different assessment. So how do you respond to Miko Peledz's assessment to Israel and coronavirus?
Look, we should, as I say, we should judge the results. We should criticize Israel for not spreading the vaccination also in the West Bank, which is under direct control of Israel. That's a crime. We should obviously fight against Israel for the siege over Gaza, which is a crime by all means. But when it comes to Israeli citizens, Israel reacted quite well. And I think that when the government is doing something reasonable, something that should be appreciated, we should say the truth and say, in this phase, Netanyahu did the right thing.
Okay, interesting. And that's a perfect, that's a perfect segue then to this question. Now, a lot of times when people talk about Israel, I sometimes think that there's too much focus on the occupation of Palestine, and not enough on Israeli socioeconomic affairs, but also what Israel does beyond, Palestine, Lebanon, and, warmongering with Iran. So, and because this is a topical program, but also a history program, what is Israel's real role in the world? What has been Israel's real role in the post-World War II, post-colonial, post-Cold War world? And does Israel's settler colonial project in the occupied territories, does that expand to Africa, Latin America, and even the pivot to Asia, the anti-China hysteria and the anti-Russia hysteria, and the ongoing civil war in Ukraine?
Israel, from its establishment, from its beginning, was and is the darling of the West. And Israel knew how to use it and to get out of it the maximum, based on guilt feelings of the West because of the Holocaust, based on anti-Semitism, which is many times exaggerated in the descriptions of Israel, and also based on this image that Israel is this villa in the jungle, as one of our prime minister phrased it, that Israel is the Western white outpost, like South Africa was the Western white outpost vis-a-vis the blacks, the Islamists, the primitives, the dangerous, or the communists in former times. That's the role of Israel throughout the years. Israel, in any criteria, got a different treatment by the world rather than any other country in the world. When big, strong Russia is invading Crimea, within weeks, the EU put sanctions on Russia. Russia is much stronger than Israel and much bigger than Israel, obviously. Israel is occupying now the West Bank and partly Gaza for 53 years, and the word sanction is almost not legitimate to be mentioned in the context of Israel.
And let's not forget the Golan Heights, illegally occupied
And the Golan Heights.
Syria.
Absolutely. If you just mention sanctions together with the word Israel, immediately you are accused as an anti-Semite. No other way. So it is a special rule. Israel has almost total immunity. And so many crimes of war that Israel is committing on a daily basis, and so many violations of the international law, and nobody thinks really to bring Israel to justice, to make Israel accountable, and to make Israel pay for those crimes. I cannot recall one example, maybe the United States, which is really above any suspicion and above any charges, but the United States is the United States. Israel enjoys this total impunity and immunity, and as long as this is the case, Israel will not change.
Now, Israel, when they supported the coup in Congo that saw the rise of Mobutu, and then supported the second coup, which overthrew Mobutu and saw the Rwandan, Ugandan-backed thug Kabila. Israel also supports Paul Kagame's oppression and suppression of everyone and anyone in Rwanda. Israel supports the ongoing attempt to overthrow the democratic socialist government of Maduro in Venezuela. Israel also supported the coup against Hugo Chavez. Israel supported the Western EU NATO-backed coup in Ukraine, which has led to what you talked about, Crimea, going back to Russia, and Israel supported Idi Amin when he came into power. Israel, for all of it, for this image that it's surrounded by enemies, Israel is a partner in crime to the Western Gulf War in Syria, as well as Yemen. And apparently Israel has even also helped exported ISIS and reactionary Wahhabi Islamists into Syria to overthrow Assad. Now, does Israel support all of those governments, all these reactionary movements, because they say to Mossad and the Israeli deep state that, hey, if you support us, don't worry, we'll not say a word about Palestine on the world stage, and you can invest in our governments. You can even give us arms, and we'll just stay silent on Palestine? Or does Israel just do what it does because it's just simply a kindred spirit to the Anglo-American Canadian empire?
It's both. It's not one and not two, they are both. First of all, you forgot in your list to mention the Israeli support to the apartheid regime in South Africa.
Yes.
For many, many years, including nuclear projects, including, the fact that Israel was more or less one of the very few countries that the South African Prime Minister could visit. And those contacts were very, very intimate when the whole world put sanctions on South Africa. Let's not forget this. By the end of the day, the main calculation of Israel is, if you just support our occupation, then you are our friend, and then we do anything for you. We will not ask any questions, not about your regime, not about your policy, not about your country, just support the occupation. Another condition which just helps a lot Will you be a client for our arms industry? And in most of the cases that you mentioned, there is also a lot of arms trade between those countries and Israel. Israel is a regional and maybe international superpower in terms of developing and producing arms, and those are Israel's clients. And for this, Israel is ready to close its eyes about any issues like democracy or even genocide in some cases that you mentioned. And this brings us back to the fact that Israel does not see any moral calculation as a calculation for deciding about its policy. Morality is for the weak ones. We believe only in power. Morality is nice for seminars, for conversations, for those leftist bourgeois, but the Israelis, for them, there are no moral considerations, like there are no legal considerations, namely the international law. Here it is only about business. Either you support the occupation or not, either you buy our weapons or not, and if you do those things, you are our friend.
Wow, that's a perfect segue then to my fourth question, which is, given Bibi Netanyahu, I mean Benjamin Netanyahu, and Likud are the dominant force in Israeli and international affairs, and most of the other parties are all Ultra Zionists abroad, neoliberals at home, Jewish supremacists. And of course, Israel has a very powerful deep state, the Mossad and all of the other, secret services. And given that, during the Trump administration, the U.S. Moved its embassy to Jerusalem, and given that Likud and none of its coalition partners want to dismantle all of the illegal settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Biden and all of the powers to be, whether it's Boris Johnson, Jacinda Ardern, Scott Morrison, Justin Trudeau, never are going to sanction Israel. And of course, there's now, Israel and its allies are trying to force everyone to adopt the IHRA definition of Israel, in which you can't say that Israel was founded as a racist state, and that Zionism is, Zionism is or can be a racist ideology. Is there no hope for justice for Palestine, and are we going to see the end of Palestine as we know it? And we might as well just say to Palestinians and all other victims of Israeli imperialism, just come to our country and you get citizenship, because there's no changing the ultra Zionist state of Israel.
There is a hope. I can't say there is no hope, even though the hope gets farther and farther. But first of all, let me remind you that if we would have talked from the late 80s, and I would have told you that within months, the apartheid regime in South Africa is going to fall, Soviet Russia is going to fall, and the Berlin Wall is going to fall, you would have thought that I'm out of my mind. Nobody had foreseen it. And it happened. For the long run, there is a possibility. There is a possibility. I didn't believe in it before, but in the recent years, there is a possibility that the Palestinians will never get to their justice. There is a possibility. For many years, I thought there's no possibility, because finally they will get their rights. I'm not sure today, because Israel is by far too strong, and the Palestinians, unfortunately, are by far too weak. The world had really abandoned them. The Arab world couldn't care less. They are divided. They lost the spirit of struggle. Israel, in many ways, really smashed them. So I cannot guarantee, like maybe I did before, that, it will take another generation, another 2 generations, and they will get to the rights. I'm not sure anymore. But in the same time, there is a hope. The only possible hope is if the world will intervene through civil societies and then governments. Without the intervention of the world, nothing will happen. Israel will not wake up one shiny morning and say, let's put an end to all this. No way. Only if Israel will start to pay and to be punished for its crimes, only then chance that it will change its policy, because Israelis will ask themselves, does it worth it? Today, there is no question like this because we pay nothing for those crimes. And by the end of the day, the only chances of a one-state solution, a one state with equal rights, one person, one vote, that's the only chance. Those who continue to speak about the two-state solution are just wanting to feel good with themselves, to believe this solution is still on the table when it's not, and they know it's not achievable anymore, they know it. But it's more convenient to speak about the two-state solution because it's a simpler solution. The only problem is that this train left the station and will never be back. So if we will change the discourse and start to speak about only equal rights, not settlements, not borders, nothing, equal rights, this is what we demand. Equal rights to all the people who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. This should be the case, and for this case we should struggle, and let's see where does it lead us to.
My second to last question is, can you talk to me about because I think allies to Palestine and those Israelis and Jewish anti-Zionists such as yourself who live in Israel and those who live outside of Israel, a lot of us had a lot of hope that Jeremy Corbyn was going to really, smash back against the unjust system. But when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, yes, he was subjected to a very intense smear campaign from Israel, from his opponents in Britain and outside of Britain. But Jeremy Corbyn and his entire leadership team and those pseudo-leftists who claim to be supporters of Corbyn, they all kept saying, instead of calling a BS to the smear campaign, they kept saying there's an anti-Semitism crisis, we're dealing with it. And they threw many of their supporters, many of them who were Jewish anti-Zionist supporters of Corbyn, they threw them under the bus. So can you talk about why you think Jeremy Corbyn did that, given his honorable track record of defending Palestine? And doesn't that mean that that those of us on the left and the anti-colonial movement, we still have a huge problem with the whole progressive on everything except Palestine, or regressive on everything, especially Palestine?
Above all, it shows how long at heart is still the way for justice. Because Jeremy Corbyn was a hope, you can't deny it. It was a hope for all of us. By the way, for a time, even Barack Obama was a hope. I don't compare between the two, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't compare. But when Barack Obama was elected, I thought that things will change. And not only they didn't change, if they changed for the better, not for the good.
Yeah.
But Barack Obama was for sure someone whose heart was in the right place. I'm sure that if we would have met Barack Obama, the guy who compared between black slavery and the Palestinians, is someone that understands the problem, but was ready to do nothing to solve it. Jeremy Corbyn was a victim of, as you say, a very well orchestrated campaign led by Israel and the Jewish lobby in the UK, together with other factors, and they just destroyed him. And this makes me very worried because finally you have already someone who has a chance, who really could be a game changer. Because once the UK would start to speak in a different language, you know, Bernie Sanders was a small hope in the United States. Maybe it would have bring other countries to be more courageous about Israel, because at the end of the day, it's all about courage. Are you ready to speak for the truth or not? And when it comes to Israel, most of the European statesmen are not ready to speak for the truth. If you meet them, I met several foreign ministers in Europe. When you sit with them in a closed room, you hear the truth. But they are not capable of doing anything about it because they are paralyzed by this campaign which labels each of them who dares to criticize Israel as an anti-Semite. And as long as this continues, and as long as European societies are ready to be to cope with this manipulation, then we are in a big problem. I was very sorry that Corbyn didn't make it, but I don't think that Corbyn should be blamed for this. He was put really in an impossible corner by a very strong and heavy machinery.
Well, his advisors certainly let him down. I think his advisors certainly let him down. John McDonnell certainly let him down, and like I mentioned, even even those, I call them the the World Socialist website calls them the pseudo-left, because even very popular new left-wing programs in Britain when Corbyn came into power, a lot of them were also saying, yeah, there's an anti-Semitism crisis, we're dealing with it, and they engaged in gross slander of Jackie Walker and countless other Jewish anti-Zionist voices, anti-racist voices, but I think the lesson learned is that when you the moment you give the moment you give your enemies a little bit of appeasement, you've just given them all the ammunition they need to continue to smear you. And not only are you throwing Palestine under the bus, but you've destroyed your entire people power project and your socialist reformist project, right?
Right, I totally agree.
So the last question I wanted to the last question I wanted to ask you is, I don't know if Israel's been covering a lot the Jeffery Epstein scandal, this oligarch who was trafficking young girls. Whitney Webb, formerly of Min Press News, now part of The Last American Vagabond, and does her own indie project called Unlimited Hangouts. She actually exposed that the Israeli deep state, the American deep state, the British deep state, and the American, Sicilian American mafia, and the Jewish American mafia with its partners in Israel, and their friends in the entertainment business and in the fashion business, all colluded to do a human trafficking network and a sexual blackmail operation. Now, Jeffrey Epstein is dead. There's not too much focus on that. I don't know if any of your colleagues or any bloggers in Israel have been covering this. The question I want to ask to you, if you are familiar with Whitney Webb's work, is why aren't more Palestine justice activists and critics of Israel and U.S. and British foreign policy all coming together to expose this, show solidarity to the Epstein victims? Because at the end of the day, a lot of the gross crimes against humanity Epstein was doing this was to do the bidding of U.S., British, and Israeli imperialism in Palestine and abroad.
No, I'm not sure I know enough about it. In Israel, there was some focus about Ehud Barak, who was
Yes.
former prime minister and who was connected with Epstein. But there were not enough evidences, and he obviously denied everything. And Israel has this tendency of focusing on its own local issues because there are so many. So it didn't become a big issue here. And there were also not enough evidences to show the involvement. So I really have nothing to say about it because I know too little.
Okay, no problem. Well, interesting, and I'll actually make sure to send you the links to all of that because I actually interviewed Whitney Whitney Webb on the it was an epic 3-part episode. Alrighty, well, Mr. Levy, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but but going forward, I mean, yeah. What do you say to people, both in Israel who are who are like-minded to you, the Elon Papes of the world, the Amira Hasses of the world, the Miko Peleds of the world, those in Israel, because internationally there is a robust Palestine justice movement, despite the epic smear campaigns and stuff like that. But what do you say? But what do you say to those in in Israel who want to speak out? They're afraid to speak out because they've seen the marginalization you face, that Elon Pape faces. So what do you say to those in Israel and to Jews outside of Israel who are anti-Zionist and want a just solution to Palestine, but are simply way too afraid because they're afraid of being ostracized and to use a Catholic term, excommunicated from their communities when it comes to speaking the truth on what Israel does in Palestine and the world.
Those are very bad times in Israel for this. We are facing now a wave of McCarthyism, like really the worst times in the United States, in McCarthy's times. And there is also no demand. There are no clients for the truth in Israel, not when it comes to the occupation. People don't want to know, people don't want to hear. The media doesn't want to bother their readership and viewers. And it's off the table. And right now, it's maybe the worst time ever since 48 in terms of even trying to raise your voice, because nobody's going to listen. Therefore, the hope is, and almost the only hope is, from change from the outside. Change in the campuses in the United States, which we are already foreseeing, we are witnessing. Change in Europe, even though I'm very worried that Europe is losing its interest. Even the more progressive circles are sick and tired because it leads to nowhere, because we don't see any progress, any achievements. So you still see many courageous activists everywhere, but I'm afraid that even their voice is becoming more and more limited, and their numbers maybe are smaller and smaller. I hope I'm wrong. In the United States, maybe in the campuses, there is some hope, but by and large, it's a very bad time now because Israel really succeeded in doing this, in implementing this strategy in which any criticism of Israel about Israel is anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
It was a hell of a success. It paralyzed many people in Europe, media. It's very hard to criticize Israel today in European media. Very hard. You'll be immediately described as an anti-Semite. So those are really bad times. But you know this expression that the darkest part of the night is the part before dawn. So we can only hope, but inside Israel right now, to do what I do and some others that you mentioned, is quite a mission impossible right now. I have no illusions. We cannot do a change because Israel's attention is somewhere else. Brainwash system is very, very, very efficient. The media is totally cooperating with the government when it comes, by the way, by its own will, not that someone forces it.
Yeah.
Only because of commercial considerations, not really censorship, but commercial consideration. The viewers don't want to see it, the readers don't want to read about it, so we will not tell them. So those are really not very promising times. But as I say, we shouldn't lose hope.
All righty. Well, it's all about, hey, keep calm and carry on. And as and as many people say sometimes, freedom is a constant struggle, and even though racial apartheid is gone, we now have to fight against economic apartheid. And just because you do get rid of a dictator doesn't mean that the unjust legacy still needs to be rebuilt. But hopefully, but yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, if racial apartheid in South Africa could collapse, if the USSR, and I know my comrades who are communists would disagree that it was a good thing that the USSR folds in. But that said, unjust systems can be overcome if there is will, and even in the darkest of times, people still have to carry on, because in your opinion, do you think that when people just say there is no hope, you're actually allowing more of the powers to be to continue on with the unjust system?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
All right. Well, Mr. Levy, Mr. Levy, it was such an honor to speak to you today. I hope that this will be the first of many conversations. And I hope all will be well with all of your colleagues, your families, your friends, including those in Palestine, as this ongoing coronavirus and the colonial project still continues to get worse and worse. But I hope all will be well. And thank you so much for your time. It was a real honor to speak to you.
Thank you very much, Youri. Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Likewise.
Good luck.
You as well.
Bye.